Continuing my series on World War II tanks that need adding to War Thunder, we now come to Italian World War II tanks. And despite a large number of Italy's tanks already being in game, we still have a few unique prototypes of well-known Italian tanks and a large variety of tank destroyers and other vehicles that still need adding. So starting off with Italian tanks, Italy is actually in a pretty good place with regards to its major tanks being in game, with most of the major tanks and their variants already being added. That said, there are a few that still need adding, starting with the Caro Comando Semovente M41, which was an Italian M1441 medium tank that was converted into a command tank for use in coordinating Semovente units. The design itself came about in early 1941, with one of the big changes being the removal of the turret and the 47mm gun, instead replacing it with a hull-mounted 13.2mm breeder machine gun. Now this might not seem like a very good armament, but in-game it has a penetration of 25mm at 100 metres, depending on what ammunition types are used, just 2 to 4mm less than the M2 Browning machine gun as used on the M2A2 at 1.0, meaning that this can still be a lethal weapon against lightly armoured targets, while also being quick firing. Though of course being mounted in the hull does mean having to turn the whole tank to engage enemies outside of its limited traverse. Armour should remain broadly the same as the regular M1441, maxing out at 30mm for the whole front, which is not a bad amount of armour for the early tiers, while the turret's previous position has now been plated over with armour, protecting the crew inside from small caliber aircraft weapons. Of course, with the removal of the turret, the Caro Commando should be able to move faster, especially with regards to acceleration. While the original top speed of 21.7 miles per hour or 35 kilometers an hour may also be exceeded, making this a far more mobile tank, while the crew count should remain at 4. The Caro Commando Semovente would have to be added at 1.0, much like the American M2A2. Perhaps before the AS-42 or L333cc, with this acting more like a tank destroyer than the faster M2A2, but still retaining its reasonably thick armour, making this a tough tank to take down frontally for some other 1.0 tanks, and while very different from other Italian tanks, I think it would be a cool model to have in game. Like I said earlier, most Italian tanks are already represented in War Thunder, so we will now skip over the various Italian medium tanks and straight to the Italian P40 heavy tank, or more specifically the initial prototype of this tank, which came in 2 different configurations, at least with regards to the weapons. So both variants could be added, and I will refer to them as the P4018 and P4032. Also, just to note, sometimes sources will refer to this tank as the P40, P26, P75 or P2640, the latter Italian designation being P for pesante or heavy, then 26 for the weight in tonnes, and then 40 for the year it was adopted. But this naming convention was dropped in August 1942, so P40 would be a more accurate designation, though the old one would remain in unofficial use for some time, and of course it's only a heavy tank by Italian standards, while most other nations would probably consider it more of a medium tank. So the P40 initially came about in August 1940, when Mussolini ordered the development of a new 25-ton heavy tank that was to be armed with a 75mm length 18 gun in one turret, and a 20mm gun in a second turret, with an additional 3 to 4 machine guns also to be carried, while the armour was to be 40mm thick for the front and 30mm for the sides. A 420 horsepower engine was to be used, and a crew of 5 was to man the tank. Based on these requirements, 3 wooden mock-ups would be constructed, 2 by Ansaldo and a third by the Army's Centre for Motorisation Studies. The Ansaldo design would be chosen for further development, with this being armed with the 75-18 gun, though it was also designed so that a 75-32 gun could be fitted if required, with the 20mm gun being placed in a coaxial position, and the armour maxes out at 40mm for the front, and a diesel engine was to be used. A prototype would be made in 1941 and was ready for testing by December, which is the guise in which we will look at this tank. So as mentioned, it was initially armed with the Abiche de 75-18 Modello 34 howitzer, which in-game is fitted on the Semovente 75-18 M41, and is a bit of a mixed bag. with its two APC-BC shells penetrating 39 to 44mm at 500m depending on which one is used, but a heat shell with 100mm penetration can also be carried, and this will likely be the main shell players use, while a HE and smoke shell round off this armament. However, as mentioned earlier, the P40 was modified to carry the longer barrelled 75-32 gun, which was installed later on, and this has a much better performance, firing the same heat shell but at a greater muzzle velocity of 580 meters a second versus 399 for the howitzer, while its APC-BC shell penetrates 66mm at 500 meters, giving this gun a greater versatility against armour, while HE and smoke shells can also be carried. Lastly, two machine guns make up the secondary armament, with the requirement for a 20mm cannon seemingly being dropped by the time the prototype was constructed. Meanwhile, the armour was now improved and was now 50mm for the front and 40mm for the sides, which is a great improvement over the 30mm of the M1340, though unfortunately the armour is flat-sided, which makes it more vulnerable than other designs with sloped armour, while the use of rivets would increase its vulnerability in real life, though many contemporary British tanks also suffered from this weakness and it doesn't really have any effect in game. Meanwhile, the 24-ton tank had a top speed of 24.8 miles per hour or 40 kilometers an hour, again faster than the M1340's top speed, but unfortunately this was obtained using a 330 horsepower SPA 8V 12-cylinder diesel engine, as the previously hoped for 420 horsepower engine hadn't panned out, stifling the potential mobility of this tank. And lastly, the crew was to be 4, 2 in the turret and 2 in the hull, the same as the M1340. In War Thunder, I could see the P40 with the 75-18 howitzer being added at battle rating 2.7, and the P40 with the 75-32 gun at 3.0, with both being folded between the M1542 and the production P40, plugging that gap in the Italian tech tree, while also allowing us to experience a unique Italian heavy tank before its eventual development into the ultimate P40 design. So you might be thinking, well, all of this is very interesting, but the tank that has been on screen can't possibly be the P40. I mean, it doesn't even look remotely the same as the production P40. Well, in real life, the P40 prototype was successfully tested from December 1941, initially with the howitzer, which would have been able to deal with fortifications and most British tanks, then with the 75-32 gun, which of course would perform better against armour. However, while the P40 had been in development, combat reports had been coming in from the North African front, while Germany had launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, and soon the Italians began to receive reports of combat from that front, as well as reports about a new Soviet tank, the T-34, and in 1942 they would get their hands on one for testing. Following these reports and examination of the T-34, the P40 would undergo a major redesign, now being fitted with sloped armour, the even longer 75-34 gun, and even a large driver's hatch like on the T-34. In this guise, the P40 would be ordered into production, but only 3 were built before the armistice of Cassiopea, which was signed in September 1943 between the Kingdom of Italy and the Allies, resulting in the Germans confiscating much Italian equipment, including the P40s, with 101 subsequently being produced for German use, though 40 of these were produced without engines for use as fortifications on the Gothic line. The P40 was supposed to be replaced by the P43, a 30-ton tank with either the 75-34 gun or a length 25 105mm gun, as well as a maximum of 80mm of armour and a 430 horsepower engine, but this design never progressed beyond a wooden model. So moving on from the tanks, we can now look at Italian armoured cars, and again, most of these are already represented in game, but there are a few that could still be added. Starting with the Fiat AB611, which is technically from the interwar period, but wasn't covered in the Italian interwar episode. This armoured car was designed by Ansaldo in 1932 and came in 2 variants, one with 3 Breeder 6.5mm machine guns, 2 in the turret and 1 at the rear, and another variant with a 37mm Vickers Turney 3740 gun, the same as used on the M1139 medium tank, giving it a penetration of 26mm at 500 meters, or 36mm at 100 meters with its APHE shell. Not a great performance, but not too bad for Tier 1, while 2 machine guns were fitted to the turret and hull rear. Armour is light, maxing out at just 15mm, but there is some sloping for the front, maximising this limited protection, though the sides are flat-sided, which isn't particularly great. While the top speed is 17 mph or 28 km/h on a 56 horsepower engine, which isn't particularly fast, especially considering this top speed is for when it's used on road, with the off-road speed being even worse, and a crew of 5 manned the armoured car. In-game, I could see this being added at 1.3, as this armoured car, while slow and not particularly well armoured, is at least decently armed, with an okay if not spectacular 37mm gun, allowing it to take down tougher enemies than some other armoured cars can, and it would be nice to see this little known armoured car in War Thunder. In real life, these armoured cars served a limited role in the 1936 Italian invasion of Ethiopia, where the issues with poor off-road driving quickly became apparent, and while some did survive into World War II, they weren't particularly successful due to their poor design and lack of spare parts. Moving on to the World War II period, there are a few armoured cars that still need add-in, starting with the Autoblinder AB42, a prototype armoured car that was designed as an improvement to the already in-game AB41. So the AB42 came from a 1942 requirement given to Ansaldo and Fiat for an improved design of the AB41 that was better suited to being used in the North African desert, while also having more armour but a reduced weight. As you can see in the picture, the AB42 on the left is smaller than the AB41, which helped reduce the weight, while other features were also removed to save on weight and complexity, such as the dual steering system, which had allowed for the control of the AB41 from the rear of the car, which might have been useful in urban environments to escape ambushes, but was proving to not be so useful in the deserts of North Africa, while the rear machine gun was also removed. The armour also now maxed out at 22mm for the turret front and 8.5mm for the rest of the armoured car, with this armour being more sloped than on the AB41, which helped to improve the protection while not increasing the weight. Meanwhile, the main armament was the same as the AB41, being a 20mm Breeder Model 1935, with a maximum penetration of 27mm at 500 metres with its APIT shells, and 31mm with HFAP rounds. So there's no improvement over the AB41 here, while an 8mm Breeder Model 1938 was carried in a coaxial position, the rear machine gun as mentioned having been removed. The engine was also now improved, now producing 108 horsepower and giving a top speed of 50 mph or 80 km/h, slightly faster than the AB41 and allowing this armoured car to get around the map even better than the AB41. Lastly, the crew complement was 3, which is 1 less than on the AB41, and makes the AB42 more vulnerable to being knocked out via crew losses. I think this could be added at 1.0 in a folder with the AB41, or maybe at 1.3 between the M1139 and AS4247, with this operating mostly the same as the AB41, being marginally better protected and having ever slightly better mobility, while also being more vulnerable due to the loss of one crew member, but it would still be cool for this prototype armoured car to be added to War Thunder. In real life, only one prototype was produced by the 7th of November 1942 in preparation for testing. However, around the same time, the Second Battle of El Alamein was being fought and would end in an Axis defeat just a few days later, with Italian and German troops forced to retreat back to Tunisia, where they would ultimately surrender in May 1943. In light of these setbacks and the time and resources that would be lost in converting the various factories to produce this new armoured car, it was decided to keep producing the AB41, with the prototype being scrapped in 1943, though the turret and engine were fitted to the AB43, allowing the design to live on in a sense. There would also be more armoured vehicles that were fitted with the 20mm Breeder autocannon, which brings us to the rather odd looking Autoblindo TL37 Autoprotetto S37, which had the 20mm autocannon mounted in an open-topped turret, with the rest of the vehicle protected by up to 8.5mm of armour, with a crew of 2 to 3 carried and a top speed of 31 mph or 50 km/h. This would work at 1.0, maybe 1.3 at a push due to the addition of armour, and would definitely be a unique vehicle in the Italian tech tree. In real life, only one prototype was made and sent to North Africa for trials, but unfortunately it appears to have broken down and was captured by British troops in the autumn of 1941. so this wasn't particularly successful, though it was developed into a rather more successful armoured personnel carrier, with the Germans converting at least one of these to carry a 47mm gun, which could also be added. There was also a variant of the AB-41 armoured car that was fitted with a 47mm gun in an open-topped fighting compartment, greatly boosting the firepower from the original 20mm gun, while still retaining a good top speed of 49.7 miles per hour or 80 kilometers an hour, making this a great vehicle for shoot and scoot situations and flanking attacks. The open-topped nature of the fighting compartment does make the gun vulnerable to enemy fire, but as we've seen, the armour only really maxes out at about 8mm anyway, so pretty much any enemy could deal with it regardless, though of course aircraft will now have an easier time of dealing with it with smaller caliber weapons, while the total crew count now appears to be 3. In War Thunder, I think this could work as a premium or event vehicle, or maybe could be folded with the AS-42-47 on the regular tech tree, with it giving Italian players a fast and hard-hitting vehicle for use in the low tiers. In real life, only one prototype was made, but like with the AB-42, it was built just after the reversal of Axis fortunes in North Africa, so it was decided not to put this vehicle into production. We then come to the Lancia 3-row Blindato, an armoured truck that was built on the Lancia 3-row heavy truck chassis in 1944 by the Repubblica Sociale Italiana, or Italian Social Republic. This essentially being a pro-German puppet state established in still German-controlled parts of Italy. Armour, as to be expected, is not the best, maxing out at just 9mm, though some sloping is incorporated to maximise this protection, but overall it is still a very vulnerable vehicle. Meanwhile, the armament is okay, being a 2070 Scotti Isolta Fraschini autocannon, which has a penetration of 22mm at 500 metres or 27mm at 100 metres with SAPI rounds, which isn't a great performance, but should be decent enough for Tier 1, and it can double as an AA gun, though its 12-round magazine could also be an issue if you don't knock the enemy out in the first few hits. On top of this, 3 8mm machine guns were also carried, which can be useful against soft-skinned vehicles or the occasional enemy aircraft. Understandably, all of these weapons required a lot of people to man them, so 7 crew were carried, making this a fairly tough vehicle to take out via crew losses. Lastly, the top speed is 25 miles per hour or 40 kilometers an hour, not terribly slow but not particularly fast either, especially as this top speed will be for when travelling on road, with off-road speeds being worse. In-game, I could see this being an event vehicle at 1.0, being lightly armoured and not having the best armament in the world, but it would still be nice to see this unusual armoured truck in-game. In real life, only a handful of these trucks were built, mainly for use against partisans, though one of these was involved in the convoy that was evacuating Benito Mussolini to Switzerland at the end of the war, though of course this was a failure and he would be captured and then executed shortly afterwards. The RSI would also build their own armoured car design, the Carrozzeria Speciale su SPA Fiberti AS43, though this was built only in single-digit numbers, with this having a 20mm autocannon and 8mm machine gun in a fully enclosed turret, 8mm of armour, a 3-man crew, and a top speed of 31 miles per hour or 50 kilometers an hour, and this could make for a good Tier 1 armoured car for the Italian tech tree. So moving on from armoured cars, we now come to Italian self-propelled guns or Semavente vehicles, and there are an absolute ton of these that still need adding, starting with the Semavente da 4732 su Scafo L3, which was a 1939 prototype SPG vehicle that was based on the L335 chassis, and this could work as a Tier 1 tank destroyer. Looking at the armament first, it is armed with the Cannone da 4732 Modello 35, the same as used on the Semavente L40, having a penetration of 37mm at 500 metres with its APHE shell, or 41mm with its APBC shell, which is a decent performance for Tier 1, while a HE shell can also be carried to deal with unarmoured enemies. Unfortunately, the vehicle itself has practically no armour, maxing out at 14mm for the whole front, while the gun crew only have a lightly armoured gun shield for protection, and even this was missing in the initial design, while protection from enemy aircraft is non-existent. To make matters even worse, only 2 crew are carried, this being a driver and gunner, making this very easy to knock out via crew losses, while even injuries will massively reduce crew skills, making this a very vulnerable vehicle. The top speed, however, is okay at 23.6 miles per hour or 38 kilometers an hour, allowing the vehicle to get around the map in a decent amount of time. I could see the Semavente L3 being added at 1.0 between the L333cc and the L40, or perhaps folded with the L40, with this being very similar to the L40 but being slightly slower and more vulnerable. But either way, it would still be nice to see this prototype in-game. In real life, the prototype was completed and ready for testing, but ultimately was abandoned, with efforts instead being focused on the L40, M40, and other better Semavente designs instead. So the Semavente L3 wasn't a great success, with the Semavente L40 going into production instead, though I believe the prototype for that vehicle had an armoured roof, which also might make for a good variant to have in game, while the actual production version would see some success in service, but its 47mm gun would become less effective against enemy armour as time went on, while also not being the best suited for destroying enemy fortifications. However, in 1941, a Semavente with a more effective 75mm howitzer would be developed, and this would go on to be used to great effect by Italian forces. This was the Semavente M40-7518. Now, you might recognise this tank destroyer because it was built in at least 3 major variants. The initial one on the M1340 medium tank chassis, the next on the M1441 chassis, which is the one we have in game, and then lastly on the M1542 chassis. So that means we could still get the first and last variant of this Semavente, and we will start by looking at the initial variant based on the M1340 chassis. Now, there aren't too many major differences here to the one that we have in game, but the Semavente itself weighs a little less, at 13.1 tonnes versus 13.5 tonnes, while also having a less powerful engine, giving a slower top speed of 19.8 miles per hour or 31.8 kilometers an hour, versus 20.7 miles per hour or 33.3 kilometers an hour for the M41, while the roof-mounted weapon was a 6mm machine gun instead of the 8mm of the M41. Other than this, there aren't really any other differences, with it still having a maximum of 50mm of armour, a 3-man crew and the 75mm howitzer, which is capable of penetrating 44mm at 500 metres with its best APC-BC shell, or 100mm with its heat shell. To differentiate the M40 and M41, I would suggest placing them both in a folder, with the M40 being added at 1.7 without the heat shell, giving players a reason to carry on and unlock the M41 for access to the better shell, but still allowing the Semavente M40 to have some decent success in Tier 1. And it would be nice for this original variant of the well-known tank destroyer to get some recognition in War Thunder. In real life, the M40 would only be built in small numbers, about 61 including the prototype, but was successful enough that production would continue on the improved M41 chassis, while the M40 variants would continue to fight on until the end of the North African campaign. So the Semavente M41-7518 that is already in game would become the next major variant, with 162 being built, and when the M42 medium tank replaced the M41 on the production line, it was decided to start using that chassis, resulting in the Semavente M42-7518. Again, there are some changes to this design. For example, it now uses a petrol engine instead of a diesel one, giving it an improved top speed of 23.9 miles per hour or 38.4 kilometers an hour, faster than the previous M40 and M41, though the weight has now increased to 15 tonnes, which is not ideal. The armament, as to be expected, is the same as the previous Semavente vehicles, but it appears it could also fire a different heat shell, the Granata Affretto Pronto Speciale, which supposedly could penetrate 120mm of armour. However, because it has its fuse on the base of the shell rather than the nose, this often made this shell act like a Hess shell, which is represented on some Italian shells in-game, so this might allow us to have a different type of shell rather than just an improved heat shell. The M15 also carried a smoke concealment system, which worked by dropping one of 5 smoke grenades at the rear of the tank, which you can then reverse into to gain some cover. Although, of course, this isn't particularly great if you're detracked or if you've lost your engine. But if you are able to move quickly into reverse, you will be able to hide yourself from enemies, improving survivability. Meanwhile, the armour should be the same as the M1542, though the superstructure is now made up of one 50mm plate instead of 2 plates, which in real life makes it more effective, but in-game doesn't seem to have any effect, and it seems to be represented as one plate on the previous Semivente vehicles anyway, while lastly the crew is still free. In-game, I could see the M42 being added in a folder with the other 7518 variants, probably at 2.0, maybe 2.3 at a push, as this really depends on how the EPS shell performs, as an improved heat shell would be rather welcome, but if it's added as a HESH shell, I can't see it being very popular, especially with how wonky HESH shells seem to be working in the game at the moment. But it would still be nice to see this final variant of the Semivente 7518 added to War Thunder. In real life, the Semivente M42 7518 would go into production from November 1942, with 260 being built, but didn't see much, if any, combat until the Armistice of Cassibla, when Italian forces in Rome tried to fight off German attempts to occupy the city, though unsuccessfully. After this, 55 would be built for the Germans, and was subsequently used by the Germans and the Italian Social Republic against the Allies and Italian partisans, with the partisans capturing some of these vehicles and a few surviving to the time of the Italian Republic after World War II. So the Italians had a good vehicle that could work against tanks and enemy fortifications, and better designs would be produced as the war went on. But fortunately most of these are already in game, but there are a few modifications of these designs that could still be added. In fact, one variant that could be added extremely easily is the 7534 M43 Bersaglieri, which was actually in the game files for quite a few years, though it has since been removed. Unfortunately, it is kind of understandable why this is the case, as this Semivente vehicle is basically the same as the M43 already in the tech tree, but now has 3 machine guns mounted at the front of the vehicle, which is unusual to be fair, but is unlikely to make much of a difference in game. I assume this was originally created as a potential premium or event tank destroyer, but was never added due to being not much different to the regular variant, and thus was passed over in favour of better vehicles, but it could still be added at some point in the future. There was also a Semivente variant created by the Germans after the Armistice, this being the Semivente M42T-10525, which as I understand it is basically a Semivente M43-7546, but with the 75mm gun replaced by a 105mm gun. This would essentially operate much like the M43-10525 that's already in game, but with the armour maxing out at 95 to 100mm, and the gun having slightly less traverse and possibly a slower top speed or acceleration due to the larger gun. The 105mm gun would also have worse penetration than the 75mm gun, penetrating 89mm at 500m with its APC shell or 120mm with its heat shell, versus 148mm for the 75mm gun, making this worse against enemy armour. In-game, I could see this being added at 3.0 to 3.3, probably as an event vehicle, as the gun is still pretty effective against armour, while the protection of the vehicle has been increased, allowing it to better take on enemies in straight-up fights with better chances of survival, making this a fairly good improvement over the M43-10525. Lastly, for Italian-tracked Semivente vehicles, we have the Semivente 14940, which looks similar to the Semivente M41M that's already in game, but unlike that vehicle which is intended to fight tanks with its 90mm gun, the Semivente 149 was instead armed with a Cannone Ansaldo 14940 model 1935 artillery gun, which is able to fire HE shells at 800 meters a second, with these having between 4.8 and 6.4 kilograms of high explosive, giving a maximum penetration of around 45 to 50 millimeters, which isn't the worst in the world, but the gun itself would have a fire rate of 1 round per minute, making this tricky to use in the presence of multiple enemies, making this best suited for long-range shooting, which makes sense as it is an artillery weapon. It also has an elevation of 0 to 45 degrees, which makes aiming from a hold-down position rather problematic, while the traverse is 53 degrees, a little bit better than the 45 degrees of the M41M. The vehicle itself is also rather mixed, being based on an M15 42 medium tank or P40 heavy tank chassis, and as you can see technically doesn't have anywhere for most of the crew to sit, with the driver and commander likely sitting in the tank itself, and the gunner and at least 2 loaders being housed within a separate vehicle, which could be represented by a second vehicle in game or a towed trailer perhaps. Naturally, this also makes the gun crew extremely vulnerable as there is no armour protecting them, while the armour for the vehicle itself maxes out at 25mm, so it doesn't really provide much protection in the grand scheme of things. But bear in mind it was an artillery vehicle with a range of 23km, so it wasn't really expected to come under direct fire. Lastly, the top speed is 21.7 miles per hour or 35km an hour from a 250 horsepower SPA petrol engine, which is an okay top speed, though not spectacular by any means. Honestly, this would best work as an event vehicle, as this probably wouldn't work very well within the regular tech tree, but would still allow for Italy to have a good artillery vehicle, and I would still like to see it added to War Thunder. In real life, only one prototype was made, before being taken over by the Germans in 1943, who seem to have tested it for themselves, before it was captured by the Americans in 1944 or 1945, either in Italy or France, and it was later moved to the Aberdeen Proving Grounds and now survives to this day at Fort Sill. So that is the Italian-built Semivente vehicles, but after the Italian invasion of France in June 1940 and France's subsequent surrender, Italy acquired many French tanks, including a small number of Char B1 bis heavy tanks, somewhere between 8 and 20, and even one Char B1 Ter. These tanks were not used in combat by the Italians, but it was decided to produce a Semivente vehicle out of at least 2 captured Char B1 bis tanks, these becoming the Semivente B1 bis, which involved removing the turret of this vehicle and leaving it with just the 75mm howitzer in the hull. This 75mm howitzer is actually more powerful than the turret-mounted 47mm gun, with its ABHE shell penetrating 50mm at 500m, versus the 47mm gun's 47mm, but it also has a lower muzzle velocity of 470m a second, making longer distance firing harder. While naturally being based in the hull, it only has an extremely limited traverse of just 1 degree, though to compensate it is able to turn on the spot pretty quickly. It also has excellent armour protection, with 60mm for the front, 55mm for the sides and 50mm for the rear, making this an extremely well protected tank, while the whole roof armour is 25mm and the turret area has been plated off with 60mm of armour. The original Char B1 bis weighed 32 tonnes, while without the turret it weighs 28 tonnes, still far heavier than even the biggest Italian tanks outside of the Fiat 2000, while the original Char B1 bis's top speed of 17.4 miles per hour or 28km an hour could potentially be improved, or at the very least the acceleration will be faster due to the removal of the turret. It's also possible that the original 4 crew is reduced due to the removal of the turret, though I haven't seen any evidence as to whether this is actually the case. In game, I could see the Semivente B1 bis being added at 2.3 to 2.3, probably as a premium or event vehicle, as we have an extremely well protected tank that is capable of taking out most enemies that it meets, while being hobbled by its slow speed and potentially lower crew count. But this would be an extremely unique tank destroyer, playing very differently to the original Char B1 bis, and it would be nice to see this vehicle in game. In real life, only 2 of these tanks would be converted, with testing taking place from November 1941 until May 1943. But neither of these vehicles were ever used by the Italians in combat and no more were converted. Now, these next vehicles probably more qualify as Cold War modifications, but I'm going to mention them briefly as they are based on World War II vehicles, with the first of these being based on M7 Priests that were given to the Italians after World War II, these being designated the Semivente 105-22 M7, with around 148 being delivered. However, in 1958, 4 of these would be upgraded with longer-barrelled 105mm guns, becoming the Semivente de 105-34 Priest. Now, from what I understand, these would still fire the same shells as the M7 Priest, but at a much higher muzzle velocity on account of the longer barrel, giving them around 27mm penetration with HE shells or 130mm with heat shells, but of course at a higher muzzle velocity than the 427 meters a second of the original howitzer. The rest of the stats should be broadly the same as the regular M7 Priest, bar a slightly reduced mobility from the extra weight from the longer barrel, and I could see this variant fitting in game at around 2.7, giving us a rather unique Italian modification of an existing American World War II vehicle, and showcasing Italian attempts at upgrading these vehicles for the Cold War. The Italians also received Canadian Sexton SPGs, and there appears to have been a similar conversion of these in 1961, with their 87mm 25-pounder guns being replaced by Austro-Hungarian 100mm M14s, or a Beechey de 117 Model 14 in Italian service, with these then being rebored to 105mm and receiving a muzzle brake, becoming the Semavente Sexton de 105-22. These would again fire the same ammunition as the 105mm gun of the M7 Priest, or having a top speed of 25 miles per hour or 40 kilometers an hour, a maximum armor thickness of 32mm, though like with the M7 Priest, the fighting compartment is completely open, leaving most of the 6 crew vulnerable to enemy tanks and especially enemy aircraft. Like with the Semavente de 105-34, I could see this going at around 2.7, probably folded with that vehicle, and again this showcases Italian attempts at upgrading these aging vehicles so that they could still provide useful service in the Cold War. In real life, quite a few of these Sextons seem to have received this upgrade, and these remained in service until 1975, so it seems that the Italians were very happy with this upgrade. So those were the many Italian tracked Semavente vehicles, but there were also many Italian designs that fitted various armaments onto many different types of wheeled vehicles. For example, the AS-42 or Sariana was armed with a wide variety of weapons, such as 20mm autocannons or 47mm guns, with those variants already in game, but it was also sometimes armed with the Solothurn S18 1000 anti-tank rifle, which has an armour penetration of 35mm at 300 metres, which isn't too bad for an anti-tank rifle, while the vehicle itself has a top speed of 52 miles per hour or 84 kilometers an hour. There could also be 2 to 4 crew, as the autocannon variant in game has 2 crew, while the 47mm variant has 3, and 4 were sometimes carried in real life, giving Gaijin some options in this regard, while naturally the armour is non-existent. This could probably be added at 1.0, being folded with the AS-42 with the 20mm autocannon or the AB-41 armoured car, giving us a quick vehicle at 1.0 that is easy to take down, but is also able to deal some decent damage to enemies at this battle rating, and it would make for a cool variant to have in game. Talking of unusual looking vehicles, I have to say that this Camionetta AS-37 fitted with a 47mm gun and oversized tyres did catch my eye while researching Italian vehicles, and I would also like to see this added if possible. Attempts were also made to fit the 47mm gun onto the Lancia 3-row truck, becoming the Autocannone de 4732 su Lancia Row NM, giving us a mobile tank destroyer vehicle with 7 crew, non-existent armour, but a decent gun and a top speed of 28 miles per hour or 45 kilometers an hour, allowing this to act as a quick scoot and shoot tank destroyer, and I could see this doing well at Tier 1, battle rating 1.0 to 1.3. Captured British trucks would also be converted into autocannone vehicles, with Morris C8s being fitted with Italian 65mm length 17 mountain guns, which could fire smoke, HE and AP shells at 348 meters a second, as well as EP and EPS heat shells with 120mm penetration. Though as mentioned, some of these heat shells functioned more like HESH shells due to the fuse being fitted at the base of the shell. An 8mm breeder machine gun was also mounted at the front of the vehicle, giving protection against other soft-skin vehicles. Again, like with the other truck-mounted weapons, armour is non-existent for the 5 crew, though with a top speed of 40.3 miles per hour or 65 kilometers an hour, it should be able to at least avoid most enemies or get away quickly when under fire. I could see this Morris vehicle working at 1.7 to 2.0, probably folded with the 100mm armed Lancia 3-row, giving us a faster alternative while also potentially having a faster fire rate, and it would be cool to see this conversion added to War Thunder. We then come to the Autocannone de 7527 su Fiat SPA TL37, which was a conversion of the TL37 artillery tractor, now armed with a Cannone Ficus Terni de 7527 Modello 1911, which could fire smoke, shrapnel, HE and AP shells with 50mm penetration at 500 meters, as well as heat shells with presumably 100mm penetration like with the other Italian 75mm guns. Unfortunately, armour is again non-existent for the 4 crew, While the original 23.6 miles per hour or 38 kilometers an hour top speed is no doubt affected by the addition of such a large gun. I could see this being added at 1.7 to 2.0, maybe lower if added without the heat shell, and this gives us yet another option with regards to truck-based weapons. More trucks still would be converted to take heavier weapons like the 90mm Breeder, with one of these variants being in-game as a Battle Pass vehicle, though other truck chassis were used as well, which could in theory be added to the tech tree if needed. But there were also trucks with even heavier weapons like the Autocannone de 102-35 SU Fiat 634N, which carried a 102mm Cannone Schneider Ansaldo de 102-35 model 1914, which was originally a naval gun and bears no relation to the 102mm gun carried on the P-108 bomber. Luckily for us, while it can fire HE shell, which will no doubt be deadly to most enemies, according to the NavWeps website, it could also fire an AP shell weighing 15 kilograms at 750 meters a second, which I haven't got exact penetration figures for, but will probably penetrate over 100 millimeters of armor, and in real life did knock out 15 Crusader tanks at over 1000 meters, so clearly these were very powerful weapons. They were also quick firing, with a maximum fire rate of 20 rounds per minute, or about a round every 3 seconds, though I suspect its reload rate will be a little bit slower when added in game, while the elevation and depression was somewhere between 90 degrees and -10, depending on which mount was used. Of course, there is no armour, and the top speed is limited to 18.6 miles per hour or 30 kilometers an hour, while a crew of 6 is carried. I think this would be a very good vehicle to have in game, probably at tier 3, though the battle rating is going to be very dependent on the performance of the gun, but I think this would give us an excellent weapon for Italian players to use, and I would like to see it added to War Thunder as a priority. In real life, only 7 or so trucks had these guns mounted, and they seem to have been rather successful against British tanks, inflicting heavy losses at the Battle of Bir el Gobi in November 1941. But with so few available, they would be whittled down over time, with the last vehicles captured by Britain after the capture of Tobruk in November 1942. So now we come to Italian anti-air vehicles, and again there are an absolutely bewildering array of vehicles that were used in this role, but unfortunately they mostly seem to be armed with the Breeder 20mm autocannon, leading to a lot of overlap between them all. I would definitely like to see this 20mm armed AS-37 added, though the cab might make forward firing awkward, but it could be added at 1.0 ahead of the AS-42 already in game to compensate for this issue. I also think the SPA Dovunque 35 could be another good alternative, having less of a cab to get in the way of the 20mm gun, making this a bit more useful against ground targets, while still having a good top speed of 37 miles per hour or 60 kilometers an hour, and making this a decent vehicle for getting around the map at tier 1. I could go on, but honestly we are just looking at various Italian and captured cars and trucks that were all fitted with 20mm Breeder autocannons, all of which could be successful to different degrees in the anti-air and anti-tank role, but frankly I think most of these would have to be a very low priority for add-in, as they are only really suited to tier 1, which would lead to a massive glut in very similar anti-air vehicles at this tier. So that brings us to the end of this episode, looking at Italian World War II tanks, and I'd be interested in your views on these vehicles and any others you would like me to cover. So I should be covering Sweden in the next episode, so hopefully you're looking forward to that and will join me for that video. Anyway, thank you for watching, I've been Tyranno, and I'll see you next time.